I think I would have kept writing, and where I quit writing for years, and just I got lazy about that. I really wasn't inspired to write.
George Strait, the king of country, has always been known as the man who did things the right way. From his first days in the spotlight, he built his image around loyalty, family, and tradition. For decades, Strait kept himself out of the scandals that wrecked so many of his Nashville peers. No arrests, no wild affairs splashed across tabloids, no outbursts on stage. He became the very definition of discipline in an industry defined by chaos. But at 73, that image began to crack in the most unexpected way. During a rare interview, George decided to open up about something he had never dared say out loud. He revealed that throughout his life, there were 7 people, 7 names, who he secretly wanted to sleep with. The statement was more than a confession. It was a revelation. It shattered the spotless image he carried and forced fans to see him as not just a country legend, but as a man with temptations, secrets, and desires he never acted upon but could no longer deny. For over 4 decades, George Strait carefully constructed a public image that seemed almost unshakable. In an industry filled with shattered marriages, drunken brawls, and career-ending scandals, he remained the quiet cowboy who rode high above the chaos. When tabloids tried to find dirt, there was none. He rarely granted interviews, never flaunted his private life, and avoided the temptations that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. His fans believed him to be the perfect family man, a symbol of loyalty and discipline in country music. But behind closed doors, George was still human, and like all men, he wrestled with desires that did not match the mask he wore for the world. His peers whispered about his quiet sense of humor and the rare moments he allowed himself to talk about what truly fascinated him. It wasn't drugs or wild nights, it was people. People he admired, people he desired, people who stirred something inside him that he never dared act upon. These feelings were tucked away in the shadows, hidden even from those closest to him. What made it even more shocking was the range of names. They weren't just glamorous women from Hollywood magazines, though some were. They weren't just fellow stars from the Nashville stage, though one name carried more weight than any fan could imagine. There was even a man among them, a revelation that shook the traditional image Strait carried in the eyes of millions. George had always been the master of control. He controlled his voice on stage, controlled his career by refusing to chase trends, controlled his family life by keeping it locked away from the cameras. But control doesn't erase temptation. Control only suppresses it. And now, at 73, George confessed that these secret crushes, these hidden desires, had stayed with him throughout the decades. They shaped how he viewed stardom, how he navigated fame, and even how he wrote and sang about love. For years, fans thought his ballads were pure fiction, stories, crafted for the audience. But what if they weren't? What if the longing in his voice came not only from memory and heartbreak, but from unspoken fantasies he could never reveal? His admission forced a new perspective on his life's work. Songs like "The Chair," "I Cross My Heart," and "Carrying Your Love With Me" suddenly seemed different when viewed through the lens of secret desires and untouchable temptations. The George Strait that fans thought they knew was disciplined, loyal, and untouchable. The George Strait that emerged from his confession was human, conflicted, and far more complicated than anyone expected. And so, the question burned brighter than ever. Who were the 7 people that haunted George Strait's thoughts for decades? When George Strait finally spoke the first name on his list, jaws dropped. It wasn't a country singer, it wasn't someone from Nashville, it was a Hollywood actress whose fame reached its peak in the 1980s. Her name had been whispered through households across America, her face on every magazine cover, her roles defining an era of glamour and power. George admitted that he was completely mesmerized by her, not just for her beauty, but for the way she carried herself with a fire and independence that he could never embody. To him, she represented freedom, the kind of wild, untamed spirit he often sang about but never allowed himself to live. Strait explained that every time he saw her on screen, he felt a pull, a curiosity about what her world must have been like compared to his. While he rode horses, wore his hat, and lived within the traditions of country values, she represented the other side of the coin. Hollywood lights, red carpets, whispers of scandal, and the kind of raw confidence that could own any room. He confessed that when he was a younger man, her posters hung on tour buses, her movies were played late at night when he should have been sleeping, and her smile haunted him during long stretches on the road. But he also admitted that this desire was never about betrayal or stepping out on his marriage. It was fantasy, a private dream, something to keep tucked away in the back of his mind when the loneliness of fame became too much to bear. He joked that even his bandmates probably knew how often he spoke her name, though they never dared tease him about it. For George, it wasn't just attraction, it was admiration. She was powerful, untouchable, and in many ways symbolic of everything he could never have. To fans, it was shocking to hear their hero confess to such a simple human temptation. After all, George Strait had built a career on keeping his private life invisible. Yet here he was, admitting to the kind of crush that millions of ordinary men had whispered about in the same decades. The difference was that he was George Strait, the king of country, whose honesty now stripped away the image of perfection and left only truth. And with that first name revealed, everyone watching knew that the next 6 would only become more shocking. Because if George Strait could admit to fantasizing about one of the most glamorous actresses in Hollywood, then who else was hidden on that secret list of 7? If the first name shocked fans, the second name practically sent tremors through the walls of Nashville. George Strait admitted that one of the 7 people he secretly desired was not a Hollywood actress or unreachable movie star, but a fellow country singer, a woman whose presence in the industry was as undeniable as his own. She was bold, unapologetic, and unafraid to break rules in a world that expected women to be quiet, polite, and predictable. She had a voice that could shatter glass and a stage presence that commanded attention, and George confessed that he was captivated by her from the very first time they shared a bill at an awards show. Their friendship stretched over years, with countless backstage encounters, shared laughs, and moments when they stood shoulder to shoulder before the flash of cameras. To fans, it always looked professional, a camaraderie between 2 of the greatest stars in country music history. But George revealed that under the surface, the chemistry was undeniable. He admitted that every duet, every handshake, and every conversation carried a tension he had to bury deep inside. For a man who valued loyalty and never wanted to damage his marriage, it was a burden he carried in silence. He recalled nights on the road when her songs would come on the radio, and he would find himself transported into a world where the what-ifs played endlessly in his mind. He described her not only as beautiful, but as dangerous, a woman who lived with a kind of freedom that both fascinated and terrified him. Unlike George, who built a career out of control and precision, she was unpredictable, fiery, and always seemed to be rewriting her own story. Perhaps that was why she pulled at him so strongly. She was the embodiment of everything he didn't allow himself to be. Fans who heard this confession immediately began to speculate. Who was this mystery woman? Was it one of his contemporaries? Someone like Reba McEntire or Tanya Tucker, whose boldness and stage presence rivaled his own? Or was it someone younger who carried the rebellious spirit of a new generation of country stars? George never revealed her name publicly in that interview, leaving just enough mystery to fuel decades of gossip. But what mattered wasn't the exact identity. It was the truth that even the king of country was not immune to forbidden temptation. The revelation was groundbreaking because George had always been the man who avoided every scandal, every hint of an affair, every tabloid headline. Yet here he was, confessing to carrying a flame for someone who stood beside him in the same world of rhinestones, cowboy boots, and smoky backstage corridors. For fans, this wasn't just a glimpse into George Strait's personal desires. It was proof that his humanity was far more complicated than the clean image he projected. The music industry thrives on speculation, but this time the speculation came straight from George himself. With two names revealed, a Hollywood actress who symbolized untouchable glamour and a country superstar who represented forbidden temptation, the list of 7 was no longer a joke. It was a confession that peeled back the curtain on a man who had spent his entire career hiding his private longings. And the next revelation, the third name, would shake the foundation even harder. Because the third person on George Strait's list wasn't a woman at all. By the time George Strait revealed the third person on his secret list, the audience believed they had heard it all. A glamorous actress from Hollywood, a forbidden crush from inside the world of country music. Surely the next name would follow the same pattern. But George paused, smiled with a kind of nervous charm, and then spoke words that no one expected. The third person wasn't a woman at all. It was a man. The room fell silent. For an artist who had built his career on traditional country values, whose songs celebrated love between cowboys and cowgirls, this revelation was more than surprising. It was seismic. George admitted that in his younger years, he had admired a certain Hollywood legend, a man whose rugged good looks, charm, and larger-than-life presence commanded every screen he ever appeared on. He described it not as love, not even necessarily lust, but a kind of magnetic pull that blurred the line between admiration and attraction. He said this man had a confidence that radiated from within, a swagger that seemed effortless, and an energy that made him unforgettable. George confessed that he would watch this actor's films repeatedly, not just for entertainment, but because he found himself mesmerized by the strength and masculinity the man carried with ease. For a private man like Strait, admitting this was monumental. In a world where country music has long been dominated by images of cowboy masculinity and rigid tradition, George's words were revolutionary. He made it clear that attraction isn't always about desire. It can be about energy, about spirit, about recognizing something in another human being that stirs feelings you can't quite categorize. And yet, George was honest enough to admit that yes, there was a spark, a moment of temptation in his thoughts, even if he never acted on it. To fans, this revelation humanized him in a way they never anticipated. The king of country, known for his stoicism and restraint, had just admitted to something that broke every stereotype about who he was supposed to be. Some critics immediately began to question his legacy, while others applauded his honesty, calling it the bravest moment of his career. George's words echoed beyond the interview itself. They forced people to reconsider what attraction really means, and challenged the idea that desire fits neatly into categories of male or female. He confessed that this name had stayed with him for decades, tucked away in his thoughts the same way the others had. And though he never revealed the actor publicly, The mere idea that George Strait had carried such a private fascination was enough to change the way fans looked at him forever. The confession was not just about desire, it was about vulnerability. It was about admitting that even the most disciplined, controlled, and traditional figure in country music was still human, still capable of feelings he didn't always understand. By adding a male name to his list, George Strait broke down barriers fans never imagined he would touch. And with this revelation, the anticipation only grew. If the first 3 names carried this much weight, then what could possibly be waiting in the remaining 4? By the time George Strait reached the 4th name on his list, the atmosphere had shifted. The crowd listening leaned in closer, unsure of what would come next. This time, George's tone softened. He wasn't confessing a fantasy that stayed tucked away in his mind. He was revealing a moment from his past that carried both embarrassment and humor. Decades earlier, when he was still a rising star, not yet the king of country, but already turning heads across Nashville, he had found himself face to face with one of the most famous women in music at the time. She was radiant, her name known around the world, her voice filling stadiums, her fame far beyond his own. George, filled with the confidence of youth and fueled by a few too many late nights on the road, decided to take a chance. He admitted that he approached her directly, charming smile and all, with an offer that was far less subtle than his usual manner. For George, who was never known to be bold off stage, this was uncharacteristic. Perhaps it was the thrill of the moment, the rush of standing in front of someone who seemed larger than life, or maybe it was just the unexplainable pull of desire. Whatever it was, he asked her out, not for dinner, not for a quiet chat, but with the directness of a man swept up in the moment. And then, to his surprise, she turned him down flat. No hesitation, no lingering second thought, just a simple, firm rejection. George laughed about it years later, but at the time, it stung. He confessed that it was one of the only times in his life when he felt truly small, when fame and charm weren't enough to break through. The rejection reminded him of something that most men learn early on, that no matter who you are, no matter how famous or successful, desire doesn't always go both ways. George explained that he carried that memory with him not as a wound, but as a humbling reminder that fantasies don't always match reality. What struck fans most wasn't the fact that George Strait had been rejected, but the fact that he was willing to admit it so openly after decades of silence. For a man who rarely even allowed glimpses of his personal life, sharing a story where he failed at something as universal as attraction was disarming. He humanized himself in a way no carefully crafted song or polished interview ever had. The mystery of who this global superstar was only fueled the speculation further. Fans began guessing. Was it a pop icon who dominated the charts in the 1980s? Was it a rock singer whose fame dwarfed even George's in his early years? Or was it another country star who simply didn't see him in the same light? George never revealed her name, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because the memory itself was more important than the identity. What mattered was the lesson. Even legends face rejection. And in George Strait's case, it made him not less of a king, but more of a man. His confession proved that desire often comes with risk, and sometimes the risk doesn't pay off. Yet this moment, as humbling as it was, didn't stop George from carrying the other names in his mind. And the 5th and 6th names on his list would prove to be even more personal, even more revealing than anything he had confessed so far. By the time George Strait revealed the 5th and 6th names, the audience realized this wasn't just a list of fleeting crushes. It was a window into the private world of a man who had spent his life guarding his image with steel walls. unlike the Hollywood actress who symbolized untouchable glamour, or the country singer whose chemistry with him burned behind every shared stage, or even the male actor whose presence stirred something unexpected. These next two names weren't about fame at all. They were about personal obsessions, secret infatuations that George carried quietly for years, tucked away from even his closest friends. The first was a television host, a woman whose smile lit up the screen in living rooms across America. She wasn't a singer, she wasn't an actress, but George admitted that her warmth, her voice, and the effortless way she connected with people left him spellbound. He confessed that while others watched her shows casually, he watched with a different kind of focus, memorizing her expressions, the way she laughed, and the kindness she radiated. To him, she wasn't just a personality. She was a vision of comfort and charm, someone who represented a softer, more intimate side of desire. The second name was even more personal, and George admitted it with a kind of sheepish grin. It wasn't a star. It wasn't someone he'd ever met. It was a model, the kind of face that graced magazines and billboards during the height of his career. He revealed that on long nights in tour buses, far from home and family, her photos became a secret escape. She embodied beauty in its most traditional form, and George confessed that her image stayed with him long after the magazines were thrown away. It wasn't love, it wasn't lust in the reckless sense. It was an obsession he never admitted to anyone until now. These revelations hit differently because they weren't tied to fame or shared stages, but to George's private life, the quiet moments no one ever saw. Fans were shocked to learn that the king of country, who seemed larger than life, had indulged in the same kind of hidden obsessions that ordinary people did. He admitted that while the world saw him as a man of discipline and restraint, inside he carried the same fantasies, the same dreams, the same private escapes that remind us all of our humanity. It wasn't about betrayal or scandal. It was about being human in the middle of a life lived under constant spotlight. George explained that these secret infatuations gave him comfort during the hardest years of touring, when the pressure of perfection weighed heavily on his shoulders. They reminded him that even though he was seen as a star, at the end of the day, he was still a man. With 5 and 6 revealed, the weight of the list grew heavier. George had admitted to fantasies that crossed boundaries of fame, gender, and profession, but there was still one more name, the 7th and final confession. That would prove to be the most shocking of them all. When George Strait reached the 7th and final name, the air was heavy with anticipation. By now, the audience had been taken through a journey of unexpected confessions. Hollywood icons, fellow country stars, an admired male actor, a pop star who rejected him, a television host, and a model who haunted his late-night thoughts. Each revelation had peeled away a layer of the man they thought they knew. But this last name went deeper than all the rest. George hesitated before speaking, almost as if he knew the weight of what he was about to say. And when he finally revealed it, the room went silent. The final person on his secret list was not a celebrity, not someone untouchable from Hollywood or the music industry. It was someone much closer to his own life. George admitted that the 7th name belonged to a woman who had worked closely with him during his career, someone behind the curtain, someone who had been a part of his professional world for years. She wasn't famous, but she had been there in rehearsal rooms, backstage corridors, long studio nights, and endless tours. George confessed that her presence lingered in his mind, her laughter echoing in ways that unsettled him, her quiet loyalty stirring feelings he had to bury deep in order to protect his marriage and his legacy. This was not just a crush. It was temptation standing a few steps away. Temptation he battled in silence every single day she was near. He explained that the hardest part of carrying this desire wasn't the attraction itself, but the restraint it demanded. Every time their eyes met, every casual conversation, every small touch that could have been nothing but felt like everything, George had to force himself back behind the wall of loyalty and control. For years he succeeded, but the memory never left. Even now, at 73, he confessed that she remained etched in his mind, not as a scandal, but as a secret he carried alone. The revelation sent fans into a frenzy of speculation. Who could she have been? Was she part of his touring band, a manager, a songwriter, or someone who worked behind the scenes in his empire? George never revealed her name, and perhaps that silence spoke louder than any confession could. It wasn't about exposing her or creating a scandal. It was about finally admitting to the weight he carried as a man who spent his entire career denying himself the luxury of falling into temptation. This seventh name was different from all the others because it wasn't about fantasy. It was about reality. It was about a flesh-and-blood person who could have changed the course of his life had he ever acted on his feelings. And that was why this final revelation shocked fans the most. George Strait, the man who symbolized discipline and faithfulness, had come within arm's reach of temptation and lived with the memory of it for decades. With this confession, his image was forever altered. He was no longer the flawless cowboy in the spotless white hat. He was human, fallible, and honest in a way that no one ever expected him to be. When George Strait finally closed the chapter on his list of 7 names, the world around him felt different. For decades, he had been the symbol of control, the embodiment of the cowboy who stayed loyal, steady, and scandal-free, while everyone else in the business seemed to be falling apart. He had carried the title King of Country, not just because of his music, but because of his image. And then, at 73 years old, he shattered that image with a confession no one expected. What fans had heard wasn't just a list of names, it was the unmasking of George Strait himself. He had admitted to desires, temptations, and fantasies that made him vulnerable, human, and imperfect in ways that fans never thought he would reveal. The list forced people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about him. The Hollywood actress represented the kind of untouchable glamour George longed for, but could never claim. The fellow country singer represented forbidden temptation, standing right beside him on stages and in studios, close enough to touch, but forever out of reach. The Hollywood male actor proved that admiration and attraction can blur into something deeper, that even George Strait carried emotions more complex than the tidy image his career presented. The pop singer who turned him down reminded everyone that even the most celebrated stars are not immune to rejection and humiliation. The television host and the model showed the quiet, personal obsessions of a man who endured lonely nights on the road, finding escape in familiar faces he could never have. And finally, the 7th name, the one closest to home, reminded the world that George Strait had lived his life towing the line between loyalty and temptation, staring at what he wanted and refusing to reach for it. The power of his confession wasn't in the names themselves, it was in the honesty behind them. For the first time, George Strait stripped away the armor of perfection and admitted that he was just like everyone else. He had carried thoughts he couldn't act on, longings he couldn't confess, and struggles he couldn't show. And by revealing them at 73, he reminded his fans that no one escapes temptation, not even legends. Some critics argued that the confession risked staining his legacy, but in truth, it did the opposite. It made him real. It made every song he ever sang about love, heartbreak, and desire sound even more authentic. Because now fans understood the man behind the microphone was drawing from experiences deeper than he ever admitted. His ballads about longing carried more weight. His heartbreak songs felt rawer, and even his upbeat tracks about love now had shadows hidden behind them. For the die-hard fans who had worshipped his spotless image, this revelation was a shock. For others, it was a relief. Proof that even the most disciplined and admired man in country music was still human enough to wrestle with the same battles they did. In the end, George Strait's confession didn't destroy his legacy. It transformed it. He wasn't the flawless cowboy anymore. He wasn't the untouchable king who lived above desire. He was a man who carried temptation quietly for decades and finally found the courage to admit it when age and time freed him from the need to pretend. That honesty in its rawest form may have been the bravest act of his entire career. And so, at 73, George Strait left fans with one final performance. This time, not a song, not a concert, but a confession. A confession that proved the king of country was still human, still vulnerable, and still capable of shocking the world, even after more than 4 decades in the spotlight.